March 1945. The cold had teeth that month. Even as spring tried to return to the battered plains of Pomerania, the air over the Oder still tasted of iron, smoke, and frozen earth. Snowmelt ran down the ditches like thin rivers of blood. From his cupola, Untersturmführer Ernst Albrecht scanned the gray horizon, a ruin of broken birches, splintered barns, and burnt-out wagons scattered along the slope that led toward the river. His Panther, turret number 232, crouched in a shallow depression like a beast half buried in the thawing mud. Its armor was scarred from weeks of retreat, dulled to a soot-streaked gray, but the engine still rumbled with a low, stubborn heartbeat. Beyond the tank, the remnants of SS Panzergrenadier Division, Nordland clung to the western bank like a tattered banner. A handful of tanks, field guns, and men who no longer believe in victory, but who still obeyed the instinct to survive. The Soviets were coming again. The morning fog was heavy enough to hide the far shore, but Albrecht could hear them. The distant growl of engines, the rhythmic pounding of artillery crossing the ice-crusted river, the harsh metallic voices that carried across the wind. The Oder front was cracking. Everyone knew it. Inside the Panther, the air was thick with oil fumes and sweat. Gefreiter Karl Wendorf, his gunner, sat hunched at his scope, a thin scarf pulled over his mouth to block the stench. Beside him, Heinz Marlow, the loader, tapped a cigarette nervously against his knee, waiting for the next order. Down below, Hans Grunewald, the driver, kept the Maybach engine idling, its low growl vibrating through the steel floor like a restless animal. Albrecht could feel every tremor through his boots. It was not just a machine, it was the world itself trembling. "Any word from battalion?" Wendorf asked, breaking the silence. Albrecht shook his head. The radio hissed with static. Somewhere far behind them, an officer's clipped voice shouted coordinates drowned out by the thunder of artillery. "Nothing useful," he muttered. "The line at Alt Dam fell last night. We hold here until further notice." "Hold," Marlow repeated bitterly. "Hold with what?" No one answered. Albrecht lowered himself into the turret, the cold periscope glass pressing against his brow. Through the mist, he saw the wreck of another Panther, hull down near the tree-line, its turret blown clean off. A column of black smoke rose straight into the colorless sky. It had been Scharfer Lenz's tank, hit by a direct shell from across the river the day before. The blast had been so violent that Albrecht still found pieces of it scattered across the field when he walked the perimeter that morning. Lenz had been his friend. Now he was just a smoldering cavity in the frozen soil. By noon, the Soviet barrage began again. The first shells came shrieking over the river, landing short in the marshes with a hollow splash. The next salvo hit closer, tearing apart the remnants of a farmhouse where a supply team had been hiding. Albrecht watched a wooden beam fly end over end before vanishing into the smoke. "Driver, reverse 5 meters. Keep the nose low." The Panther groaned backward into the ditch, its treads clanking over the frozen ruts. Mud sprayed up against the armor, and fragments of ice rattled across the turret like hail. Inside, every man instinctively ducked at the sound of each incoming round. The tank shook as shockwaves rolled through the ground. "Fire control ready," Wendorf called out, aligning his sight on the barely visible flashes across the river. "AP round loaded." Marlow slammed the shell into the breech. Albrecht steadied his voice. "Target, battery position, left of the barn ruins. Range 900. Fire." The cannon roared. The recoil slammed into their chests, filling the air with cordite. Through the periscope, Albrecht saw the shell detonate across the riverbank. A brief orange blossom of fire among the fog. Another Soviet gun fell silent. "Good hit," Wendorf said flatly, already searching for the next flash. But for every gun they silenced, 2 more seemed to appear. The barrage intensified, growing into a steady rhythm, a mechanical thunder that blurred into one endless vibration. The ground quaked, the fields turned to liquid, and the air became so thick with dust and smoke that day and night blended together into a single gray eternity. Albrecht had long stopped thinking of ideology or Führer orders or the nonsense of final victory. The slogans had died somewhere back in Latvia. What remained was duty, habit, and the strange bond between man and machine. The Panther was his last fortress. As long as it breathed, he would stand his ground. That night, the bombardment stopped. The silence afterward was more frightening than the noise. The wind carried the faint smell of burning oil and wet ash. A horse whinnied in the distance. Then a gunshot cut it short. The men inside the Panther said nothing. Albrecht climbed out through the cupola to stretch his legs, stepping into ankle-deep mud. The moon was veiled behind clouds, and the horizon glowed red in several directions. He walked a few meters away and crouched beside a frozen puddle, washing his hands. The water stung his skin like knives. The war was collapsing around him, but the reflexes of command kept him alive. He checked the tank's flank armor, the tracks, the spare wheels bolted to the rear. Everything was intact. The camouflage netting was half torn, but still enough to break the silhouette against the field. He looked eastward, toward the faint lights flickering beyond the Oder. Soviet flares rose and fell, painting the clouds in flashes of pink and orange. Somewhere out there, tens of thousands of men were preparing to cross. Infantry, tanks, artillery, endless columns. And here he stood with two functioning Panthers, one Jagdpanzer, and maybe 60 grenadiers scattered across the line. It was not defense. It was defiance. He thought briefly of his family in Bremen. The letter from his mother, now folded and soft in his breast pocket, the ink smudged from his fingers. She had written that the Americans were approaching the Weser, that the sirens never stopped. He wondered if she was still alive. Ernst, the voice startled him. It was Hauptsturmführer Victor Dunschede, his superior, a tall, gaunt officer with eyes that had seen too much since the Balkans. He had appeared from the shadows like a ghost, his greatcoat soaked, his collar insignia caked with mud. "You're still operational?" Albrecht nodded. "Panther 232 and 221. We have half our ammo. Fuel?" As he hesitated. "Enough for a few more hours of combat." Dunshede's lips tightened. "Then you'll hold this sector until the engineers finish rigging the bridge. After that, pull back to Stettin. If it's still there." He looked east again, his jaw clenching as the wind picked up. "They'll come at dawn. You can feel it." Albrecht could feel it too. An invisible pressure in the air, the charged stillness before a storm. At dawn, the Soviets came. It began with flares, dozens of them, turning the sky into a trembling curtain of red light. Then came the mortars, soft and steady, walking across the fields with terrifying precision. The Panther shook as fragments rattled off its hull. "Driver, engine on!" The Maybach roared to life. Steam burst from the exhaust as Grunewald revved the throttle. Inside, the turret filled with noise, the smell of fuel thick enough to taste. Through the mist, Albrecht saw dark shapes emerging from the riverbank. Amphibious rafts, then T-34s grinding up the far slope, their silhouettes black against the red haze. Behind them came lines of infantry, countless figures advancing through the shallows like an army of shadows. Target tank front, 700 meters. Loaded. Fire. The shell screamed across the fog and struck dead center. The T-34 erupted into flame, the explosion illuminating the next wave behind it. Windorf reloaded instantly. Next target, left by the willow trees. Another shot. Another fireball. They fought like that for hours, the world reduced to a cycle of loading, aiming, firing, shouting. The crew's faces were blackened with soot, their ears ringing. Albrecht's throat burned from shouting commands over the engine's roar. Outside, Soviet shells fell closer and closer. A direct hit rocked the Panther, slamming Albrecht against the turret ring. Metal screeched. Smoke filled the interior. "Damage report. Left track damaged." Grunewald shouted from below. "Still moving, but she's limping." Albrecht's pulse hammered in his skull. He could barely hear himself think. He switched to the commander's periscope, saw the Trilene erupting with muzzle flashes, a wall of red infantry flooding the field. Back, reverse to the secondary line. The Panther crawled backward, groaning like a wounded animal. Mud clung to its tracks, and every meter felt heavier. Behind them, Dunsheed's position was burning. His last remaining Jagdpanzer hit and split open like an egg. Through the chaos, Albrecht glimpsed Dunsheed himself, standing beside the wreck, pistol in hand, shouting orders to men who no longer existed. A shell landed nearby. When the smoke cleared, he was gone. Albrecht said nothing. He just kept shouting orders until his voice broke. By afternoon, the line had dissolved. The survivors retreated west through the woods, the tanks weaving between shattered pines. The Soviets were everywhere now, their artillery moving forward, their air power unopposed. "Fuel's almost gone," Grunewald warned. "Then we'll stop when she stops," Albrecht answered hoarsely. They passed burning villages, abandoned wagons, corpses half buried in snowmelt. Refugees stumbled along the same road. Old women, children, soldiers with hollow eyes. The sound of engines echoed endlessly in the distance. As night fell, Albrecht realized they were alone. The Panther was the last machine still moving. He could feel its heat radiating through the armor, its low rumble steady like a dying heartbeat. He ran a gloved hand over the control panel, over the familiar worn edges, the bullet dents, the scent of machine oil. He thought of everything this tank had seen: Narva, Kurland, Danzig, and now the Oder. It had outlived empires. The wind howled outside, carrying with it the faint, metallic tang of rain. "Keep moving," he whispered. "Just a little further." But the engine coughed, once, twice, and died. Silence. The Panther stood motionless in the swampy darkness, steam curling from its exhaust like breath fading from a dying creature. Albrecht didn't move. He listened to the ticking of cooling metal, to the soft hiss of the river beyond the trees. The world around him was falling apart, but inside the steel hull, there was still a strange, fragile calm. He reached for the periscope and stared into the night, unable to tell if what he saw ahead were trees or the silhouettes of Soviet tanks. And then, for the first time since the war began, Ernst Albrecht felt truly alone. The silence pressed down on him like a weight. It wasn't the silence of peace. It was the hollow quiet that comes after something enormous is broken. The air inside the tank was heavy with gunpowder, burned oil, and the faint sweetness of antifreeze. Every metal surface seemed to breathe heat. The ticking of the cooling engine was like the last slow beats of a heart that refused to stop. Albrecht sat there for a long moment in the turret seat, his gloved hands resting on the edge of the gun sight. His ears still rang from the thunder of artillery, but the world outside was still. No voices, no engines, only the low whisper of the wind moving through the reeds along the marsh. He opened the hatch. Cold air rushed in, sharp, biting alive. He climbed out slowly, one hand gripping the rim of the cupola, boots slipping slightly on the steel slicked with mud and soot. The night sky above was smeared with red and gray. Distant fires from the eastern bank lighting the clouds like dying embers. He stood on top of the tank, staring east. The Oder was no longer visible through the smoke, but he could feel it, that vast, black artery pulsing between armies. Somewhere beyond it, the Soviet columns were regrouping, bridging, preparing to push west again. The Germans had no more lines left to hold. The land smelled of rot and wet earth. Every step gave a squelch. Every movement echoed faintly, as if the soil itself were hollow. Below, Windorf pushed open the loader's hatch and looked up. His face was pale beneath a film of grime, eyes bloodshot and wild. "What now? Herr Untersturmführer," he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Albrecht didn't answer right away. The words came slowly, as though each one had to fight through the fog in his skull. "We wait until morning. Then we move west. Try to reach the Stettin road. On foot." He nodded. "If we have to." Marlowe climbed up beside him, lighting the last of his cigarettes. The glow illuminated his cracked lips and the deep lines that hunger had carved into his cheeks. "They'll shoot us if they catch us," he said quietly. "They'll shoot everyone," Albrecht replied. The cigarette burned down between them, a tiny star against the darkness. When it reached the filter, Marlowe flicked it into the mud. The embers sizzled out with a faint hiss. At dawn, Mist rolled in from the river, thick and pale like smoke from invisible fires. The fields glistened with frost. Crows circled above the ruins of a farmhouse in the distance, their cries thin and hollow. Albrecht climbed down from the Panther, boots sinking to the ankle in wet soil. He moved carefully, scanning the tree-line, his MP-40 slung over his shoulder. The tank loomed behind him like a monument, mud-caked, silent, a titan slain by exhaustion rather than battle. He placed a hand on its hull. The steel was cold now. He felt the faint texture of bullet scars, the chipped paint, the numbers, 232, stenciled in white. It was the last link to everything he had been. "Time to go," he said. The four men gathered what they could: canteens, ammunition pouches, a few tins of food from the storage box. Windorf carried the radio handset, though it had long ceased to function. Marlowe filled his pockets with machine gun, rounds he knew they'd never use. And Grunewald, silent as always, adjusted the strap on his helmet and looked west toward the low hills that marked the road to Stettin. They left the tank without ceremony. No salute, no final word. It simply faded behind them into the fog, its turret half-turned eastward as though watching their retreat. They walked for hours through the sodden fields, moving along old ditches and half-frozen irrigation canals. The landscape was scarred, craters filled with rainwater, the skeletons of trees stripped by shell fire, the occasional carcass of a horse or burned-out vehicle. Everywhere there was the smell of decay, iron, fuel, smoke, and the faint, unmistakable odor of death that clung to everything in the Oder marshes. Albrecht's legs felt heavy, but his mind remained alert. Every distant noise made him flinch, the crack of branches, the echo of gunfire carried by the wind. By midday, they reached the edge of a small village. The place was nothing but a cluster of cottages and a church steeple bent sideways by an explosion. The streets were empty, windows shattered, doors torn from their hinges. A dog barked once and then disappeared between the ruins. "Looks deserted," Windorf said. "Be careful anyway," Albrecht murmured. They moved between the houses, rifles ready. The silence was uncanny. No movement, no voices. Just the slow creak of metal sheets in the wind. Albrecht stepped over a frozen puddle and glanced through a broken window. Inside, a table lay overturned, dishes scattered across the floor. A child's toy, a wooden horse with one leg missing, rested against the wall. Marlowe crouched beside a doorway and whispered. They left in a hurry. Albrecht nodded, or they were driven out. He entered what had once been a bakery. The air smelled faintly of ash and damp flour. On a shelf behind the counter, a single loaf of bread had hardened into stone. He took it anyway, broke it in half, and gave the pieces to his men. They chewed in silence, not tasting anything. Through the shattered doorway, Albrecht could see the road leading west. In the distance, smoke still rose from the direction of Stettin. He wondered if the city was already gone. They found shelter that night in a collapsed barn at the edge of the woods. The roof had caved in, leaving a patchwork of beams through which the stars peeked faintly. The ground was cold, but dry enough to lie down. Albrecht built a small fire from broken boards. The flickering light threw long shadows across their faces. They didn't speak much. The exhaustion had turned words into something heavy and unnecessary. At one point, Windorf asked quietly, "Do you think Berlin still stands?" Albrecht stared into the flames for a long moment before answering. "Maybe, but not for long. What happens to us then?" He didn't know. None of them did. The Reich had become a word without a place. He took out his mother's letter from his breast pocket and unfolded it again, though he had read it a dozen times. The paper was soft, the handwriting elegant, and steady despite the air raids she had described. "Ernst, whatever happens, remember you were my son before you were a soldier. Come home when the time allows." Home. The words sounded foreign now. The fire crackled, and the paper trembled slightly in his hand. He folded it carefully and returned it to his coat. Outside, the wind carried distant rumblings, the sound of heavy artillery far to the east. Each boom seemed to echo longer than the one before. The front was moving again. By morning, the ground trembled underfoot. Soviet tanks were advancing through the forests north of their position. Albrecht ordered the men to move. They followed an old farm track that wound between ditches swollen with melted snow. The sun was hidden behind a dull gray ceiling of clouds. Everywhere they went, they saw remnants of the war's last agony. Columns of wounded men limping west, civilians pushing carts piled with bedding, soldiers without weapons trudging aimlessly. Some wore SS insignia, hastily torn from their collars. Others carried white rags tied to sticks. No one saluted anymore. No one gave orders. It was a tide of human wreckage flowing toward an uncertain end. Albrecht and his crew kept apart, wary of both deserters and Soviet scouts. By midday, they reach a crossroads marked by a broken signpost. One arrow pointed toward Stettin, another toward Grafenhagen, though both names were half burned away. They paused beside an overturned Kubelwagen. The driver inside had been shot through the chest, his uniform stiff with dry blood. A map was pinned beneath his hand. Albrecht pulled it free, brushing off the dirt. He traced the routes with a finger. "If we cut through these woods," he said, "we can reach the western ridge by nightfall. From there, we'll see the river crossings." Marlowe squinted at the map. "And if they've already taken the ridge, then we keep moving." They moved through the forest, stepping carefully over roots and debris. The smell of smoke grew stronger with every kilometer. Occasionally they heard bursts of machine gun fire, sharp, staccato, somewhere not far away. As dusk fell, they came upon a clearing. In the center stood what remained of a German outpost. A dugout half collapsed, ammunition boxes scattered, the bodies of 2 soldiers lying face down in the mud. Flies buzzed lazily around the corpses despite the cold. Windorf crossed himself. "Gott," he murmured. Albrecht knelt beside one of the bodies. The Mansfield cap bore the same division insignia, Nordland. He had been one of theirs. Albrecht took the man's dog tags, wiped the mud off, and slipped them into his pocket. "We moved before dark," he said quietly. Night again. The forest was black and endless, the sky clouded over. They walked by instinct, guided by the faint shimmer of the river's reflection to the east. Occasionally, flares rose above the horizon, white, then red, then green, marking Soviet coordinates. The air smelled of cordite and pine sap. When they finally stopped to rest, Albrecht leaned against a fallen tree, eyes half closed. The muscles in his neck ached, and his hands were trembling. He could still feel the vibrations of the Panther under his palms, the hum of the engine, the recoil of the gun. Even now, his mind replayed the rhythm of battle like a heartbeat he couldn't forget. It haunted him, the idea that his tank was still out there, somewhere in the dark, waiting. The thought gave him a strange sense of comfort, as if part of him had stayed behind, encased in steel, immune to the cold and the fear that consumed everything else. But when the wind shifted, he smelled fuel and smoke, and the memory turned bitter. The sound of engines came from far off, low, constant, approaching. The men froze. Albrecht raised his hand, signaling silence. Through the trees, faint beams of headlights flickered, armored vehicles moving slowly along the ridge road. Soviet voices drifted through the dark. They dropped flat, pressing themselves into the mud. The convoy passed within 100 meters, trucks, half-tracks, maybe tanks. The ground vibrated under the treads. Albrecht held his breath until the last sound faded. Only when the forest returned to silence did they rise again. Marlowe's face was pale, his breath quick. "They're everywhere," he whispered. Albrecht nodded. "We move west. Always west." By the third day, without sleep, reality began to blur. The cold seeped into his bones, dulling his sense of time. The landscape repeated itself. Trees, mud, ruins, smoke. Sometimes he thought he saw the silhouette of a tank through the mist, only for it to vanish when he blinked. In one village, they found a well still half full of water. They drank until their throats stopped burning. Nearby, a church bell lay shattered in the street, its bronze body cracked open like a shell. They passed through fields littered with personal debris. Helmets, ration tins, pages of letters scattered like dead leaves. Albrecht picked one up, reading a few words before the ink dissolved in his hands. Liebe Anna, it ended mid-sentence. Each step felt heavier than the last. But he kept going, because to stop was to vanish, like all the others who had simply disappeared into the mud and silence of that dying front. And as he walked, the sound of the wind through the reeds behind him began to sound almost like the low growl of an engine. Steady, distant, familiar, the phantom heartbeat of the panther calling him back. Under the gray shroud of April skies, the Oder Valley had turned into a cemetery of steel. Days blurred into each other, a long procession of smoke, retreat, and exhaustion. The Soviet artillery had grown closer, its rhythm now constant, like the pulse of an immense, unseen beast. The once quiet riverbanks were torn open by shells, each blast coughing mud into the air. The roads were lined with refugees, Wehrmacht remnants, and burnt-out vehicles whose crews had long since vanished into the marshes or been swallowed by the Red Army's flood. Untersturmführer Ernst Albrecht walked with a limp now, the result of a fall from the Panther when they had scrambled from a days earlier. The wound was not deep, but it throbbed in time with his heartbeat, and the ache made him slower, more deliberate. His uniform, once meticulously pressed, was caked in soot and river clay. The silver runes on his collar had darkened with grime. He carried a field map folded in his breast pocket, though the paper had begun to disintegrate from damp and sweat. On it, the thick blue line of the Oder River still marked the supposed defensive barrier, a line that, by now, existed only on paper. Villages marked in careful Gothic letters had already been erased from the earth by the advancing front. For the first time, he had stopped trying to make sense of orders. The last transmission from Division Command, received through static 3 nights ago, had been a blur of words. Hold the line at all costs. Delay the Soviet spearhead until the evacuation of Stettin is complete. But there was no line left to hold. Most of Nordland's tanks were gone, out of fuel or destroyed. Infantry companies had disintegrated, their remnants fighting as scattered bands in the woods. And yet, through all that, Albrecht couldn't bring himself to abandon the Panther. It lay a few kilometers behind him, half sunk into the swamp where he and his crew had left it. Every day since, he had returned, sometimes just to look at it, to touch its cold armor with his palm. It was like visiting a grave. The machine had been his second skin for over a year. He could still feel the vibration of its Maybach engine in his bones, still smell the heated oil, the mix of cordite and iron, still see the greenish shimmer of the gun sight when the world outside was smoke and chaos. Inside that steel hull were memories he couldn't escape. Muller's laughter echoing through the intercom. The way Feldwebel Otto had hummed under his breath before every engagement, the quiet, mechanical discipline that had once made them feel invincible. All of them gone, either buried in the mud of Pomerania or captured. He had been spared by circumstance alone. The Panther's final shell had jammed. Its tracks had slipped off on soft ground. When the Soviets overran the position, he and the loader, Karl, had fled into the reeds under the cover of night. Karl hadn't made it far. Machine gun fire from the Treeline had cut him down before dawn. Albrecht had crawled for hours, hiding among frozen cattails while tracer rounds hissed overhead. Now he wandered the ruins of that moment, unable to leave. He found shelter in a shatter barn near the village of Mestrin. The air there smelled of hay and ash. Chickens wandered through the debris, and a single horse, ribs showing, pawed at the ground near a collapsed cart. Albrecht used his greatcoat as a blanket and tried to sleep on the cold stone floor, his Luger clutched tight against his chest. Sometimes he dreamed of Berlin, not of the city itself, but of the order it represented, the straight lines, the rhythm of parades, the conviction that their war had purpose. That illusion had burned away like everything else, replaced by something raw and unbearable. He thought of his mother's letters, the last of which had arrived in late '44, speaking of Allied bombings, shortages, and prayer. He hadn't answered. What could he possibly say? The next morning, the Soviets came closer. He could hear their engines long before he saw them. A mechanical chorus carried by the damp wind. Somewhere across the river, tank treads clattered on stone. He climbed to the barn's loft and looked out through a hole in the roof. Smoke rose in the distance where the last German anti-tank positions had been. The eastern horizon glowed faintly red. He took out his binoculars, cracked but usable. Through the lenses, he saw a convoy moving along the opposite bank. T-34s, Studebakers, columns of infantry, a never-ending tide. The Red Army had turned the Oder into a conveyor belt of men and metal. And yet, something in him refused to yield. When night came again, he returned to the swamp. The air was thick and still, full of the scent of rotting vegetation. The moonlight reflected on the standing water, giving everything a dull silver hue. He followed the familiar path through the reeds, his boots sucking at the mud, until he saw it. The turret of the Panther, barely visible, emerging from the mist like a relic of another age. It was tilted slightly to one side, the right track half buried, the gun pointed west, as if still guarding a front that no longer existed. The paint had peeled where the fire had scorched it, revealing layers of brown primer beneath the faded gray camouflage. The iron cross on the hull was half obscured by mud. He stood before it, silent. A strange calm washed over him. Around him, frogs croaked, and the distant rumble of artillery echoed like thunder. He stepped closer, placed a hand on the cold steel, and whispered, "Ich bin Zurich. I'm back." The hatch creaked when he opened it. Inside, the smell hit him instantly. Stale air, rust, and the faint metallic tang of old blood. His flashlight beam caught the outlines of familiar shapes. The gun breech, the commander's periscope, a torn headset cable dangling from the roof. Everything was coated in a thin film of moisture. He lowered himself inside. The walls closed around him, and for a moment it was as if time had stopped. He could almost hear the voices again. Muller calling out target ranges, Otto muttering numbers, the clatter of shell casings hitting the floor. He sat in the commander's seat and let his gloved fingers trace the worn leather padding, the scratched metal plate where his rank insignia had once hung. He stayed there for hours, lost between memory and reality. Outside, dawn began to rise. The swamp glimmered with pale light. Somewhere far off, a Katyusha battery opened fire, its rockets streaking across the sky in bright arcs. The front was collapsing faster now. Even he could feel it in the ground. But Albrecht no longer cared. The Panther was his sanctuary, his confession chamber, and his grave. That morning, he decided he would not flee anymore. He would stay, not to fight, but to ensure that his machine, did not fall into enemy hands. He scavenged what little fuel remained in the reserve tanks, checked the battery, and tried once more to start the engine. The first turn gave nothing. The second coughed, sputtered, then fell silent. On the third attempt, a low vibration shuddered through the hull. The Maybach caught. For a few seconds, the swamp came alive. The Panther's heart beat again, louder and steadier than he remembered. The sound echoed between the trees, startling birds into flight. He sat there, trembling, tears streaking the grime on his face. Then he killed the engine. The noise would draw the Soviets, and he knew it. But he wanted to hear it once more. That was enough. He climbed out, took one last look at the rising sun, and gathered his belongings. Pistol, map, insignia. He tore the collar patches from his tunic and threw them into the mud. The war was over for him. He walked to the nearby tree lean and dug a shallow trench with his bayonet. There, beneath a tangle of roots, he buried the division emblem from his cap and his sidearm. The last symbols of a cause that had devoured everything he loved. By midday, Soviet patrols reached the outskirts of the swamp. He could hear their shouts in Russian, their boots splashing through shallow water. He lay flat behind a fallen birch and watched them advance. Young men with rifles slung across their shoulders, faces smeared with ash and sweat. One of them pointed toward the Panther and shouted something. The others laughed. They circled the tank, poking it with their bayonets, then began climbing over it like children. A few tried to open the hatches, but gave up when they found them jammed. Eventually, one of the soldiers sprayed a burst of submachine gun fire against the side, the bullets sparking harmlessly off the armor. Then they moved on. Albrecht didn't move. Hours passed. The swamp fell quiet again, save for the distant drone of aircraft. He waited until dusk before crawling back toward the tank. The soldiers had left muddy footprints on the hull, but otherwise it was untouched. He climbed up once more and stared into the empty commander's cupola. The air was heavy with humidity and decay. He knew, somehow, that this was the end, not of the war, but of himself as he had been. The Panther, he realized, would remain, hidden by reeds and mud. It would slowly sink, consumed by the earth that had witnessed their ruin. And perhaps that was fitting. Machines, like men, had their graves too. He knelt beside it, pressed his forehead to the cold metal, and whispered a final goodbye. Not to Germany, not to victory, but to the ghosts inside. When he finally walked away, the first drops of rain began to fall. The swamp rippled with concentric circles, swallowing his footprints one by one. The air smelled of wet soil and endings. Behind him, the Panther stood silent, half buried, its guns still pointing westward. The reeds swayed gently in the wind, closing around it like curtains on a stage. By nightfall, it was gone from sight, and somewhere in the gathering darkness of a defeated continent, Untersturmführer Ernst Albrecht, soldier, survivor, ghost, disappeared with it. For 70 years, neither man nor machine would be seen again. The swamp forgot their names, but it remembered their silence. Through decades of thaw and frost, the land folded its wet arms around the buried hull, sealing it beneath layers of mud and time. Seasons brushed over it, spring reeds breaking through its tracks, summer insects nesting in the cracks of its armor, winter ice drawing gray veins over the surface of the marsh. By the time the border shifted and Stettin became Szczecin, no one spoke the name Ernst Albrecht anymore. The people who had fled or fought here had turned into ghosts of their own. The Oder Valley changed hands, languages, and faces. Soviet engineers came to drain sections of the marshland, building dikes and irrigation channels. None of them suspected that, beneath the churned soil, a war machine slept intact, its steel heart locked in the stillness of the mire. For years, only a few fragments hinted at its presence. A piece of track found by a fisherman in the 1950s, a rusted shell casing uncovered by children playing near the reeds in 1968, and the whispered stories of old villagers who remembered the spring of '45. They spoke of a German officer who vanished into the swamp, of a tank that had sunk with all its crew, of the ghost lights that appeared on misty nights, blue, flickering glows that floated over the water like restless spirits. But memory, like water, erodes. By the time the Soviet Union fell, the Panther had become just another local legend. Then came the drought of 2014. The summer was the hottest anyone could remember. The odor shrank into a thin brown serpent, exposing sandbars and revealing the bones of old bridges long hidden beneath the current. Farmers in the outskirts of Szczecin complained that the earth cracked beneath their tractors. The marshes dried until they resembled a mosaic of hardened plates, the reeds turning yellow and brittle. It was in one of those fields, an unremarkable stretch of land near the village of Widuchowa, that the past began to breathe again. The man who first saw it was named Piotr Nowak, a local farmer in his 60s. He had been plowing the southern edge of his property when his tractor jolted violently and stalled. Cursing, he climbed down, expecting to find a buried log or an old fence post. But when he kicked away the dirt with his boot, he heard a sound. Not the dull thud of wood, but the metallic clang of something immense, hollow, and ancient. He crouched, brushing at the soil with his hands. The dirt was dry and crumbly, easily giving way under his fingers. Slowly, a surface emerged, dark, curved, coated with rust, but unmistakably smooth. It took him several minutes to understand what he was looking at, the slanted contour of armor plating. At first, he thought it was a piece of farm machinery left from the war. That wasn't rare. The region was littered with relics. Helmets, spent cartridges, sometimes even old motorcycles pulled from ditches. But this was different. The metal extended farther than he could reach. He followed it along the furrow, uncovering more until the faint outline of a turret ring appeared. Piotr froze. It couldn't be, he thought. Not after all these years. He ran back to his house, fetched his phone, and called his son Merrick, who worked in Szczecin as a construction foreman. Within an hour, Merrick arrived, skeptical but curious. Together, they cleared more of the surface with shovels, uncovering the unmistakable lines of a tank. A massive one, its gun barrel buried at an angle, its top half encased in compacted earth. By the next day, half the village had gathered around. Children climbed the embankment to watch as Pyotr and Merrick continued digging. Someone called the local authorities. Soon, a police car arrived, followed by a van from the Institute of National Remembrance. When the archaeologists came a week later, they confirmed what no one dare believe at first. It was a Panther Ausf. Remarkably well preserved. The experts were astonished. The metal had been sealed in anaerobic mud, protected from corrosion. Even the paint, a faded blend of dunkelgelb and olive green, clung stubbornly to the armor. But what truly stunned them was what they found inside. When a recovery team pried open the commander's hatch, a gust of stale air escaped, carrying the scent of oil, rust, and age. A camera probe was lowered through the opening. The images transmitted to the monitor inside the tent sent a ripple of silence through the observers. There, still seated in the commander's position, was a human skeleton, slumped slightly forward, one arm resting on the rim of the turret. The bones were intact, the skull tilted toward the periscope, as if watching the horizon even in death. A pair of rusted dog tags hung from the remain's neck. The inscription was faint, almost erased by time, but when the archaeologist cleaned it gently with a soft brush, the letters appeared like a whisper from another century. Untersturmführer Ernst Albrecht, SSBZ, RGT Point 11 Nordland. The name spread quickly. Within hours, local news crews arrived. Reporters swarmed the site, cameras flashing against the sunlit mud. For most Poles, it was just another ghost of occupation, another piece of the dark past rising from the soil. But for the historians, it was something extraordinary. The best preserved German tank ever found in the region, complete with its original crew compartment. The Panther became an overnight sensation. The military museum in Warsaw sent curators. The German War Graves Commission requested to handle the remains. Soon, cranes arrived to lift the 35-ton behemoth from its grave. When it broke the surface, mud and water cascaded off its hull like a baptism. Spectators gasped as the turret emerged, followed by the long barrel and the tracks that had lain dormant for 7 decades. The sunlight reflected off its armor, and for a brief moment, it seemed to shimmer with life again. Someone in the crowd began to clap, softly at first, then joined by others. Not in celebration, but in awe. For days afterward, Pyotr returned to the site each morning before the workers arrived. He would stand beside the exposed pit, smoking silently, staring at the imprint the tank had left in the ground, a perfect mold of its shape. Sometimes he thought he could still hear it humming, a deep, buried vibration that lingered in the air long after the engines of the recovery trucks had gone quiet. As the restoration began, the historians pieced together what had happened. The last known records of Albrecht's unit showed that on April 24th, 1945, Nordland had been positioned along the Oder near Stettin, tasked with holding the crossing at all costs. Most of the division had been annihilated by the end of that week. No reports of Albrecht or his tank appeared afterward. It had simply vanished, assumed destroyed or abandoned. Now, the evidence told a different story. Inside the hull, the team found a few personal items, a rusted Luger, a field map sealed in a tin case, and, remarkably, a set of letters written in fading ink. They were addressed to Lieselot Albrecht, Hamburg. The pages were brittle, the handwriting small and precise. The words spoke not of ideology or victory, but of fatigue, longing, and resignation. "We are not defending Germany anymore," one letter read. "We are defending the memory of what we thought it was." The letters were sent to Berlin for preservation, but copies circulated among the researchers. For many, they humanized the ghost in the turret, turning him from a faceless relic into a man of flesh and doubt. Meanwhile, the Panther was transported to a hangar near Szczecin for cleaning. The mud was carefully removed with brushes and water jets. Each marking, each bullet scar was catalogued. On the hull's left side, beneath the grime, a faded emblem appeared. A black sun overlaid on a white shield, the insignia of the Nordland Division. As the restoration progressed, journalists from across Europe came to film the process. Documentaries called it the time capsule of the Oder front. Veterans visited, some in tears, others in silence. But among the villagers, strange rumors began again. They said that at night, when the workers left and the hangar was quiet, the tank sometimes made noises, faint creaks, a groan of shifting metal, as if something inside refused to rest. One guard swore he had heard a soft knock echo from within the turret when the lights were off. Another claimed the temperature around the tank dropped suddenly after midnight, the air dense with the smell of oil and wet earth. Most dismissed it as imagination, the echo of history, perhaps. But Pyotr didn't. He had felt something when he first uncovered it, something heavy and watching, as though the machine itself remembered. Months later, when the tank was finally moved to the National War Museum in Warsaw, he attended the unveiling. The Panther stood on a raised platform, cleaned and restored, its gun polished to a dull sheen. The plaque beneath it read simply, Panther Ausf, G11, SS Panzergrenadier Division, Nordland, recovered near Widuchowa, 2014. Pyotr watched the crowd, tourists taking pictures, veterans standing rigid in respect, children staring wide-eyed at the enormous machine. But his gaze drifted to the empty commander's hatch. He thought of the man who had once sat there, watching the same gray sky through a different century. And somewhere deep inside that tank, beneath layers of history and steel, he imagined the faint echo of a heartbeat, steady, distant, familiar, like the whisper of the swamp wind that had once buried it. The Panther had not been destroyed. It had been waiting for the world to remember. And though the war had ended long ago, its shadow had risen again, silent, patient, and eternal, from the mud of the Oder. The Panther now stood as a monument to memory, a sentinel of history resurrected from decades of silence. Visitors to the museum moved past it, marveling at its size, its armor, and the ghostly traces of battle etched across its surface. But the machine's true story was not in the steel that gleamed under the lights, nor in the meticulous restoration that brought back its colors and numbers. Its story lay in the life it carried, the men who trusted it, the battles it endured, and the singular figure who had disappeared into the marshes, leaving the world to assume he was lost forever. Untersturmführer Ernst Albrecht was not simply a soldier who vanished. He had become a cipher, a bridge between past and present. For 70 years, his absence allowed the world to forget, to move on without the weight of his vigil. Yet the swamp, patient and knowing, had preserved him, encasing both man and machine in a natural tomb that neither time nor human neglect could breach. That moment in 2014, when he and his Panther reemerged, was more than an archaeological event. It was the moment history demanded its witness back. Albrecht's story reminds us of the strange, quiet persistence of human and mechanical endurance. He had survived not through heroics or audacious escape, but through the careful choice to hold on, to cling to a fragment of order amid chaos. His Panther, likewise, had survived not because it was invincible, but because the earth itself sheltered it. Both were symbols of endurance in a war defined by destruction, proof that some relics of human endeavor resist annihilation, awaiting the moment the world is ready to remember. In this tale, the Oder River was more than a geographic feature. It was a silent arbiter of fate. Its waters had witnessed the last breaths of countless soldiers, had carved through the mud the paths of retreat and advance, and had swallowed whole the evidence of lives and machines alike. When Albrecht disappeared into the marshes, he became part of that river's memory, absorbed into its shifting tides, hidden until circumstance, drought, human curiosity, and time brought him back into the light. The recovered Panther, while a remarkable artifact, is also a mirror. It reflects the intimate connection between man and machine, the trust soldiers place in their equipment, and the extraordinary lengths to which individuals go to preserve their own survival. Each dent, each scar, each faded insignia tells of battles fought, decisions made under pressure, and the silent dialogues between men and their tanks, between instinct and strategy, between memory and duty. To look upon it is to glimpse the human dimension of warfare, the moments when courage, fear, and desperation intersected in the mud, snow, and smoke of the Oder. And yet, there is something haunting about its preservation. In Albrecht's absence, the Panther became almost mythic, a ghost tank, a vessel of stories half remembered, half forgotten. When the world finally unearthed it, there was an eerie sense that it had been waiting all along, patient and resolute for recognition. That moment forces a reflection on time itself, on how history sometimes preserves the smallest, most intimate details, hiding them for decades until the conditions align perfectly for revelation. The survival of the tank and the skeleton of its commander is not merely coincidence. It is a reminder that history is as much about endurance as it is about conflict. The story of Ernst Albrecht and Panther 232 also illuminates the fragility and resilience of memory. Albrecht's disappearance allowed him to slip from historical records, yet the traces he left behind, letters, dog tags, faint battlefield reports, persisted like whispers across generations. Similarly, the Panther's survival was a testimony to resilience against the forces of decay, both natural and human. Together, they bridge the gap between myth and reality, reminding us that even in a world overwhelmed by chaos, threads of continuity remain, waiting to be reclaimed. Beyond the military significance, the tale carries a profound human lesson. Albrecht's journey, from the Oder to the marshes, from wartime terror to ghostly preservation, speaks to the ways people endure extreme circumstances and how the echoes of their choices resonate long after the moment has passed. His careful steps through ruined villages, his cautious vigilance in the face of relentless enemy advances, and his final communion with the tank highlight a fundamental truth. Survival is rarely about heroism in the traditional sense. It is about attunement to one's environment, an acute awareness of the forces at play, and a respect for the fragile boundary between life and death. The emergence of Panther 232 in 2014 is also a confrontation with mortality. Seeing the skeletal remains of Albrecht, seated as if still commanding, we are forced to face the reality of death in war. The way it freezes moments in time, the permanence of absence, and the lingering presence of those who have passed. Yet, paradoxically, this confrontation is not purely grim. It carries a form of immortality, a preservation of memory that outlasts politics, borders, and even nations. Albrecht, in his death, has become an enduring witness, and the Panther its vessel. The public fascination with the tank underscores the human need to connect with tangible evidence of history. Photographs of the excavation, close-ups of the rusted armor, and the skeletal form inside make the abstract horror of war suddenly personal and immediate. Observers see not just metal and bones, but a lived experience, the choices, fears, and humanity of a man caught in history's relentless machinery. Through this tangible connection, the past communicates with the present, demanding that we recognize the cost of conflict and the endurance of those caught within it. And yet, there remains a quiet, almost spiritual dimension to the story. The Panther's 7 decades beneath the swamp created a liminal space between life and death, between human action and natural preservation. It became a vessel of waiting, a silent guardian of memory, an emblem of endurance. Its recovery is a reminder that history is not just recorded in books or archives, but encoded in the land itself, awaiting attentive eyes to uncover it. The marshes of the Oder did not simply conceal a tank. They safeguarded the story of a man, his decisions, and the intimate dialogue between soldier and machine. Finally, the tale leaves us with reflection on impermanence and the passage of time. Albrecht's disappearance, the swamp's embrace, the eventual recovery of the Panther. All of it reminds us that history is cyclical, layered, and sometimes hidden. The war ended long ago, but its shadows lingered in earth and metal. The recovery of the tank is not merely an archaeological triumph. It is a meditation on human endurance, memory, and the persistence of narrative. It confronts us with the silent question of what else lies buried, waiting for its story to be told. The story closes not with a final battle, but with revelation. The world has been given a fragment of history in its most intimate form. A man and his tank, lost and forgotten, preserved by mud, time, and fate, now stand as a testament to endurance, memory, and the unbroken line between past and present. It is a narrative of survival, not triumphant, not heroic in the conventional sense, but deeply human. As visitors move past Panther 232 in the museum, it is easy to admire its engineering or the skill of its builders. But if one pauses, truly observes, and imagines the life it carried, the whispers of the Oder, and the marsh that held its secret for 70 years, one begins to understand something larger. That history is alive in its traces, patient in its silence, and capable of revealing truths long after the moment has passed. The story of Ernst Albrecht and his Panther teaches that survival is not always about victory in battle, but about endurance, memory, and the silent passage of time. It reminds us that even in defeat, even in disappearance, there are elements of human experience that persist, waiting to be rediscovered. And when they are, they do more than inform. They resonate. They connect us to the past, to the lives once lived, and to the enduring pulse of memory itself. In the end, the Panther stands not as a relic of war, but as a monument to endurance, the endurance of a man, the endurance of a machine, and the endurance of history itself. The story does not conclude with Albrecht's death, nor with the tank's recovery, but with their resonance across time. For 70 years, they slept. For decades, the swamp held its secret, and now, finally, the world can bear witness to what survives when all else is forgotten. Through steel, through mud, through letters and bones, Ernst Albrecht and Panther 232 speak across the decades, a reminder that some stories, though hidden, never truly end. Somewhere in the swaying reeds of the Oder, the ghostly heartbeat of a panther still echoes, a whisper of survival, memory, and the persistence of human experience in the face of time itself.